In the name of God, who is love, beloved, and love overflowing. Amen. I have quite a few books, which I use from time to time. I rotate them as daily inspiration to start my day. And the author of one book I recently bought is written by a former nun named Jan Phillips. The book begins with a story about taking her first theology class taught by a Jesuit priest. She, along with the rest of the class, were all young women in the process of becoming nuns. And one day in class, the priest asked them what they believed about God. Well, a few women raised their hands and took turns answering that question. And Phillips recalled that with every woman who spoke, the priest seemed to be getting more frustrated until he finally got angry enough to stop taking answers at all. At that point, he sat down at his desk, which was in front of the class, looking kind of annoyed, and after a bit of silence, he finally managed to say, "You should be ashamed for having nothing more than catechism answers to this question. Are you just a bunch of parrots repeating everything you've been taught?" After a bit more silence, he finally composed himself and said to the class, "You must come to know what is true about God from your own experience if you are to be a nun worth your salt. You have to arrive at a faith that is deeper than your learning, one that is rooted in your ultimate concerns and rises up from the nature of who you are." He said, "What you believe is your religion. Who you are, what you live for, that is faith." I found that very interesting. What you believe is your religion. All these things we have in our mind. What all your religious teachers over the years have taught you. Who you are, what you live for, is your faith. And this implies to me that to have faith means you're really invested in your relationship with God, not just repeating back what some religious leaders have said. When I read this story, I thought about St. Thomas and the other disciples of Jesus. And let's face it, the first disciples were probably very much like those young girls who swallowed hook, line, and sinker everything those priests had taught them to believe. For example, the reason the disciples believed the Messiah would be an earthly king in the line of King David, who would restore the Jewish monarchy, was exactly because that was what they were taught all their lives in their various faith communities. So when you hear later on the mother of James and John asking Jesus if her sons could sit at Jesus's right hand in the kingdom of heaven, that was a direct result of her parroting back what she, her sons, and frankly the rest of the disciples had all been taught their whole lives by their religious leaders at that time. They were taught the Messiah would be an earthly king. And this is why Jesus, like that Jesuit priest in the story, opened with, he had to re-educate, reframe their faith beliefs, because all of their beliefs were anchored in all of these thoughts people told them they had to believe. And they all were fairly similar, dogmatically speaking, particularly in the regards to who the Messiah would be, what the Messiah would experience, and the work he would do. The fact that Jesus suffered and died went against everything the disciples were ever taught. And the fact that Jesus appeared to them after his death, well, you can imagine how that blew their socks off. So bearing this in mind, we really can't fault Thomas and his difficulty in believing the disciples that they had seen the risen Lord, the Messiah. Like the young future nuns, Thomas's experience with God was not quite yet as deeply ingrained as the dogmas and that he had been taught and the other disciples had been taught. I then thought about today's reading from the book of Revelation, and particularly the way the writer greets readers by offering grace and peace from God, who is, who was, and who is to come. This way of describing God reaffirms to me the belief that God is first and foremost more of a verb than a noun. I'm sure I've said this before, but when people think of God solely as a noun, they're seeking to define with definite boundaries the greatest mystery of all time. And because everyone is such a product of cultural conditioning throughout history, God naturally became defined by the dominant culture who said he was a white male sitting on a cloud in the sky. But if God is the greatest mystery ever, who can be endlessly known in many, many, many kinds of ways, then we have to assume that God couldn't possibly be known in only one limited way. This is what I mean when I say God is much more than just a noun known by one name, one image. God is more like a verb, an endless source of ongoing creativity and diversity. In other words, you can't put God in a box. You can't limit God to only one name or even one religion. So while some theologians know God in what is known as cataphatic ways, through words and doctrines and books on top of books, the mystics, on the other hand, know God is such a mystery. They give the Creator a wide berth and say he's endlessly knowable through our experiences of love and silence and giving. And that's known as the apophatic way. Again, you can't put God in a box. Again, with St. Thomas in mind, the belief that God is an endless mystery who reveals himself through many kinds of experiences, it seems to me that this is what the Jesuit priest was trying to get those future nuns to think about in theology class. He didn't want them just repeating back what they were told to believe about God. He wanted them to share what they thought about God based on their experiences of God in their life. And so faith in God is not just about believing in our minds certain doctrines and dogmas were taught, but rather using those doctrines and dogmas and scriptures as a beginning point, balancing it out with our experiences about the depth of this endlessly knowable, or many times, sometimes unknowable mystery, and the endless possibilities of God's love for us in creation. It just seems to me that faith is more of an unfolding process as we come to know God throughout our life experiences. And the word that comes to me about this is liminality. A liminal space is a transitional area, either physical or metaphorical, that exists between two states or places. It's a space or moment that's neither fully one thing nor fully the other, always existing on the edge of change. I think that's a great and ongoing beginning point about having faith in God. Our faith should always be evolving, just as everything is always evolving. You know, just when you think we're out of hope and we're killing everything on the planet, new species are found in the places that we never would have thought they would be. We're all evolving as our experiences of God and loving and caring for others and frankly caring for ourselves is also evolving. The song Day by Day came to me from the movie Godspell as I thought about this. Day by day, oh dear Lord, three things I pray: to see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly, day by day. To me, that song exemplifies that faith is about a daily living, breathing, changing process of coming to believe throughout the course of our life experiences. As a result, the opposite of faith is not doubt, in my opinion, but certainty. When we claim certainty about our faith, we are limiting God by some measure of doctrine or dogma. Faith is a kind of willingness to live without always having concrete answers, but rather trusting in the love we have experienced of God. Faith is the willingness to live without the demand for concrete, defined answers. And so if faith is what I would call an evolutionary process, and uncertainty is the liminal space we embrace, excuse me, then frankly, doubt becomes irrelevant. In other words, each day I pray that I will see Christ more clearly in the faces of other people. Each day I hope in some way to love and emulate Jesus as I pray and learn and do good works for others, and also receiving good works from others. Many of us are not that great about that. And to practice following Jesus with a kind of Christ consciousness, whereby I value people over rules, regulations, and definitions. Each day I practice kindness and compassion over scrupulously keeping track of what my or other people's sins are. That is real faith. Barbara Brown Taylor is so much better about putting things into words. She said, to practice incarnation is to discover a pedagogy that is as old as the Gospels. Why else did Jesus spend his last night on earth teaching his disciples to wash feet and share supper? With all the conceptual truths in the universe at his disposal, he didn't give the disciples things to think about. Instead, he gave them concrete things to do, specific ways of being in their bodies together that would go on teaching them. It seems to me that all the religious wars humanity has suffered all come down to one of two things: politics masked as religion, or beliefs favored over caring for the other. So it seems to me the recipe for a lasting peace is not to assert authority over one mental construct or belief over another, but rather that lasting peace occurs as we learn to live with uncertainty, with liminality, while prioritizing care for the earth, care for ourselves, and care for one another. I think that's how Jesus lived. And frankly, I think that's how Pope Francis lived. And probably most important, I think that's what followers of Christ are called how to live. So the great teaching of St. Thomas, I think, is to trust our experiences of the divine, to trust that you are loved beyond measure, no matter how many times we mess things up. Trust in that experience of love and forgiveness without falling into cynicism. We all have experiences of God, but boy, is it tempting to just jump in there with that little inner cynic and say, oh, don't be ridiculous. That's silly. But somehow we continue to be led by unseen loving forces. So I guess I can say in all honesty, Alleluia, Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia. I don't have to know how. I don't have to speak about why necessarily. I can just stand by it and say, I know my Redeemer lives. Thanks be to God. Amen.